Okay. Welcome to the Dole Institute of Politics. My name is Jay Grignani, and I'm a member of the Dole Institute's Student Advisory Board, the official group of the Institute. The Student Advisory Board is a bipartisan group whose members can access many great opportunities through their involvement with the Institute, including volunteering at programs and networking with our special guests. If you are a student and would like to join, please contact us by emailing dolesab@ku.edu or speaking with a student worker after the program. A video of today's program will be available on our YouTube channel soon. You can also access videos of past programs by visiting our YouTube channel at any time. A loop hearing system is available to use if you have a T-coil hearing aid. We also have a limited number of listening devices. If you have questions about the loop system, or if at any time during the program you have difficulty hearing, please alert one of our staff members. After the program, we will have some time for the audience to ask questions. If you have a question, please raise your hand and a student worker with a microphone will come to you. Please stand if you are able and ask just one brief question. If you're a part of our virtual audience, you may submit your questions at dolequestions@ku.edu. The Dole Institute's mission is to foster civil and respectful discussion around important and often difficult topics. Please phrase your questions with this in mind. Before we begin, I'd like to remind you to please turn off your cell phones. And now, please join me in welcoming Director Audrey Coleman.
Thank you, Jay, so much for that introduction. It is such a pleasure to see what a wonderful crowd here this evening. We have a fantastic conversation yet ahead of us. I need to point out that now that it's January of 2023, we are in the second half of our 20th programming year, and it's officially the centenary of our own Senator Bob Dole, who will turn 100 this summer. It's hard to believe that we're marking that milestone already. Another milestone for the Dole Institute and the Presidential Lecture Series actually predates this building, the dedication of the Institute. The first Presidential Lecture Series was held in the fall of 2002. And I wanted to remind you, because I bet there are some of you in the crowd who actually attended those events, that series hosted by Richard Norton Smith, our founding director, Edmund Morris, Michael Beschloss, and David McCullough. And I think you'll agree, our guests tonight we've just maintained that standard of excellence, and we're so pleased to hear from them, and Diana will introduce them as well. This series this year, as you well know, is dedicated to the leadership of First Ladies. We haven't done a series focusing on First Ladies since 2014. Those were general biographies, but our conversations in this series are really going to focus on women's leadership, their leadership of their husbands, politics, policy, culture, and the country. And I am so excited to hear from our guests this evening. I hope you will plan to join us next week on February 9th, where our series will continue. Let me pull out my notes here to make sure I get this right. We will welcome Rebecca Roberts, who's an educator, author, also Catherine Sibley and Terry Finneman, who's a KU journalism professor, First Ladies and Presidential and Power, influential First Ladies you might not know about. So I hope that's on your calendar for February 9th here at 7 o'clock. I'm so pleased to welcome groups of students, not only our Student Advisory Board, but also students from the KU's Women, Gender, and Sexuality Studies and Political Science departments. And we are presenting this series in proud partnership with the FLAIR organization, which is the First Ladies Association for Research and Education. Our moderator this evening, and for the first three installments of our Presidential Lecture Series, is none other than Diana Carlin, and she's well known to us here at the Institute and a longtime friend of the Institute. Diana, thank you so much for doing this for us.
Well, you are welcome, and thank you for the opportunity.
And I'll let Diana introduce our distinguished guest, but most of you know Diana is Professor Emerita of Communication at St. Louis University and a retired Professor of Communication Studies here at KU. She's authored book chapters on Martha Washington, Lady Bird Johnson, Barbara Bush, Hillary Clinton, and Michelle Obama. She's the co-author of a textbook that is up and coming, almost ready to be published, getting there, entitled U.S. First Ladies, Making History and Leaving Legacies, which will be published later this year. Diana, thank you so much. And I want to be sure and mention that we have a book sale that's happening after the program. Thank you so much to University Press of Kansas. We have a number of titles that the press has put out that are one of which actually Diana and our guest Anita McBride has contributed to as well. So don't miss the opportunity to continue the conversation at home and the learning at home. With that, I am so pleased to turn it over to none other than Diana Carlin. Thank you so much, Diana.
Well, thank you, Audrey, and thank you all. This is a great turnout. Thank you very much. I want to acknowledge some of the students, I won't name them, but they're the KU students here who helped Anita and our co-author Nancy Keegan-Smith, who will be here in March. This is the first textbook that's ever been written on First Ladies. There are courses, units of courses. I taught one at KU for like 20 years, didn't have a textbook. And we have authored the first one, and there were students at KU. I have two of my students from St. Louis University who are in my class there, and then Anita arranged for a group from American University, and we had a group in New York. And Michael and Anita both came virtually to the classes, and they gave us suggestions for revisions, and the last chapter of revisions was turned in yesterday. Yay, but the very good news is that that book is also going to be out in a public version, a trade version. We'll strip out all the textbook stuff, and it'll be available next fall, and we'll let you know about it. So some of the things we're talking about tonight will be amplified. But I am thrilled that Michael and Anita agreed and could be here, and that we had great weather to get them here. And you know, these are two individuals who have had front seats to the power and influence that First Ladies have in this country. And so let me say a few words. You have their bios, so I'm not going to mention a whole lot. But Michael served as press secretary for Dr. Jill Biden during the campaign, and then up until, what, 2 months ago? And so he has seen her through, you know, some really interesting times. He's also doing some, you'll probably see him if you haven't already seen him on television. He's doing a lot of public relations and communication work now. And Anita has a very distinguished background, has worked at the State Department. She started out, which I love this story that she told my class, she started out in the Reagan White House doing mail. And I think this is a good lesson for students that you can start anywhere. And look where she ended up as Chief of Staff to First Lady Laura Bush. She's now, as you read, at American University and developed the First Ladies Initiative there. And Anita is one of the co-founders of FLAIR, First Ladies Association for Research and Education. And last week, the Dole Institute became our newest institutional lifetime member. So this is a collaboration with them, and we will be publicizing their events. They'll be doing ours, and we're hoping to do some more through FLAIR. FLAIR does monthly programs also. So look up FLAIR, First Ladies Association for Research and Education. Just Google it. And we have a great series of videos out there, too. And many of the people you're going to be seeing are on those videos as well. So thank you both for being here. So let's get to the discussion. All right. It's been said, and it really has been, since George and Martha went to New York originally and then to Philadelphia, that the presidency is really a two-person position. And a lot of that has to do with the way that we set up our government, where the president is the head of government and the head of state and head of the political party. So kind of wears three hats. And the First Lady becomes essential largely because of that head of state position, and also then later the political piece. So this presidential partnership is something that goes all the way back to Martha. And what I really want to do tonight in this conversation is look at how the position has changed since Martha, but also how it's stayed very much the same. So let's begin with that idea. And Anita, how did you observe this two-person career position when you were at the White House with Laura Bush?
Well, I think it's really an important platform for us to look at and study a First Lady and really appreciate the role that they play, that from our first president, who recognized it's a two-person job and he couldn't do it alone because of these two hats that he wore as head of government, responsible for the legislation, the cabinet appointments, all of the work of government, but also the ceremonial function. That has not changed to this day. So that partnership with the First Lady is crucial to the success of the administration and crucial to the success of the presidency. And I think every First Lady, at least, and we certainly have come to, you knew this well before I did, Diana, because you've been studying this forever, that every First Lady feels a responsibility to uphold their end of that partnership. They're most invested in their husband's success. They're a very different kind of advisor. They are a confidant. It's a very different role. And they feel a responsibility to contribute in the way that they can best. And when they are best at it is when they are drawing from their own inner reserves, their own knowledge, their own experience, the authenticity that comes with their life experiences and bringing that to the job. I saw that, of course, with Mrs. Bush as a teacher, a librarian. Education formed the platform of everything that she did. And that was one of the president's initial signature domestic priorities was education reform, and she had an enormous role to play in that. So from day one, first of all, they helped them get there, and some of our presidents wouldn't have been president without their spouses helping them make that possible. But then once they are there, they are very conscious of what they can do to contribute to their success.
Michael, what about your observations of this partnership and head of state, head of party, head of government?
Partnership's a great word for it. I know the First Lady, the current First Lady, she considers herself a partner to her husband, not an advisor. I tried to explain this a couple months ago to a reporter. They were asking me about the evolution of the role and Hillary Clinton and whether, when she came on the national stage in 1992, why didn't she keep her job as a lawyer? And what worked for their marriage was that she was an intellectual equal and a policy advisor and a gut check for him. The current First Lady, I would say, she will have made history by continuing her career, and that will probably be the most historic thing that she will have ever done. But she does not, in that same way, they are each other's gut checks, but in a different way. Their marriage is just a different sort of partnership. It's not a policy or political partnership. She doesn't love politics. Everything she does in support of him. She was able to maintain sort of her own identity, her own anonymity for a very long time in Delaware because he came home every night. And so I always felt part of her strengths are some of her relatableness and her normalness, and comes from not being in Washington for so long and keeping her career. And she wasn't trying to make history. But in the same way that she's always supported his career, he's always supported hers. And that's how she incidentally was able to make history by keeping her job, but because they support each other. And real quick, just to diverge, it's somewhat unique in that he was already a politician when she met him. She was 24. She was getting over the heartbreak of a first marriage, and he was getting over the heartbreak of losing his wife and child, and so it's very interesting story. This young woman who becomes a mom overnight and marries this United States senator, and it's funny how she talks about it. I don't think she knew enough to really be impressed. He showed up at her door with loafers and a jacket, called her on a Saturday. She already had a date, but he called her, and she was just like, "How did you get this number?" So their stories is, politics aside, their story's unique, and I think that shared bond has helped them along the way.
I hadn't thought about it until now, but there is sort of a parallel to George and Martha, because Martha was a widow and had lost 2 children and a husband, and George came along kind of out of the blue And she didn't expect to get into what she got into either.
Right.
Yet
So-
he was very lucky that she was as experienced as a social hostess that
Yes.
she was, because that's what he needed her for, and she had the burden of setting precedent.
Yeah, absolutely. So we've mentioned hostess a few times. That many of the first ladies hated that part of it. And what about the first ladies you worked with? How did they see that as a positive, or did they?
Oh, I think that, I had the opportunity. I started in the Reagan administration. You saw that probably in my bio. As I said, I started in the mailroom, so I would see what the public was writing to the president and first lady. But I certainly knew the influence that Nancy Reagan had on the White House and on the events at the White House, on the culture, the glamour of the White House. They brought a little piece of them from Hollywood to the White House, and so it was very important. They loved entertaining. They had incredible number of state dinners. The president loved it too, and they had this incredible guest list of, they were from Hollywood, so it was a lot of those Hollywood folks. It was Elizabeth Taylor and Frank Sinatra, and these were the performers at the White House. So it was very important part of what they did, but they used it for a purpose. They used it for diplomacy, for sure, and build and forge relationships. That's the important part of the social aspect of that. I think Barbara Bush loved it. She also was greatly experienced in this. I mean, George H.W. Bush had quite the resume before he became president, including serving as a top diplomat in New York and the CIA, and they were overseas in China, so they understood that. They had probably more state dinners by average in their 4 years than even the Reagans had, in 8. So they were very comfortable entertainers, and George H.W. Bush was deeply involved in the details of it. The social secretary would meet with him almost as often as she met with Mrs. Bush, and integrally involved in the seating. And again, they both understood the value of these events. And then, George and Laura Bush, now this is where they had their first state dinner in September 6th of 2001, 5 days before 9/11. And as they were hosting their first guest, which was the President, First Lady of Mexico, the both of them really thought this is the way it was going to be. That there would have so many more of these. I mean, President Bush kind of got a bad rap for not really wanting to do a lot of entertaining, but he was really very good at it. But then after 9/11 happened, it was very, very difficult to be hosting state dinners. He was hosting a lot of foreign leaders. They were coming one after the other after this horrible thing had happened to us here, and to show support, to be part of the coalition on the war on terror. But you couldn't pick one leader over another to be hosting them for a state dinner. It was just not possible. So by the time I got to be Laura Bush's chief of staff in the second term, that was one of the first things that she said to me when she interviewed me for the job, is that they felt really badly that there was this impression that they did not want to entertain, because they did. And she wanted the second term to be different. So that aspect of it picked up. But again, explaining that by saying that they recognize it's important. It's an important part of the role.
And Dr. Biden, I think, one of the things she always says is that, this role is such a privilege. While she does have her own career and her family, she is so honored that the trust was in place with her husband, and that she is honored by this responsibility in this role. And we came in at such a unique, historic time. That our convention was in Wilmington, Delaware, and it was not a standard convention. It was very scaled back, and most of it was virtual or on TV. But the inauguration was not a typical inauguration. It was very slim. There was not a lot of crowds, purposefully not a lot of crowds. And we took that seriously going into the White House because we were honoring so many Americans who had just died, and so many. And so that, the part of the ceremonial aspect that I was always asked about from reporters, who they were going to hire as a decorator, what art were they bringing, what style were they bringing to the White House, it just wasn't something that we were even considering. They didn't bring much from Delaware, and decorating and entertaining was just not at the forefront of, not just optically, there was just so much that had to be done when we got in. No president had really come into office in the middle of a crisis like this, I think, since the Depression. I mean, 9/11, of course.
But that happened
Right.
after they were in there.
And so we had a very untraditional start. And eventually, it was really important for her to host congressional spouses, bipartisan, to make sure every spouse was invited to come in, and the governor's spouses on a bipartisan basis. And so she started doing a lot of that. And they held their first state dinner this year, actually a couple days after they hosted their granddaughter's wedding. Family is very important to them, so family is constantly at the house. The grandkids are there often. It's a family affair with them.
That's great. One of the big things that's changed over time is what we call the wife of the president. Everybody thinks it's always been First Lady, but it hasn't. That really didn't happen until the 1880s that it came into vogue. So that's why we titled this From Lady Washington to Dr. Biden. So what about this whole notion of Dr. Biden using her title? Were you prepared for the kind of reactions that came from at least one writer and then everything that followed that?
No, actually, I think it was a Saturday afternoon. I think I was actually on a date. And all of a sudden, I'm getting just call after call after call. I wasn't looking at the Wall Street Journal editorial page on Saturday afternoon, but there it was. And it took us a little bit by surprise. He had an opinion. We had not. It was funny. Nobody had ever really... By that point, we were on the transition, and so she had never been attacked, really.
Well, she used it for 8 years as second lady.
Yes,
Yeah,
she did. And but even as the second spouse, I mean, she was able to go to school and without a security footprint. It was just it was lighter, it was different, but this was much more. But this was a full-on broadside attack on her, just having earned her degree, or earning the title. So she not one for wanting to fight in public or fight at all. I think we kind of let people speak for us, and that was sort of how we handled it. And I think there was just so much outrage about it in the mainstream press. I mean, the Wall Street Journal reporters were so embarrassed. They called me because they didn't want to have this relationship with the new president and first lady as a result of their editorial page. It was such a bad move on the paper's part, but here we are. And actually, it just happened again the other night when she was at the Eagles game, and Megyn Kelly tweeted something very, very, very nasty about she was sitting with Roger Goodell, the NFL commissioner, and they called her, Dr. Biden. And she was sort of attacked for that again. But it was shocking. She earned her degree. Yeah. She went to school at night. She raised kids. She did everything she could to earn that degree. And so, she felt like she earned the title.
I was so irritated, as my husband could tell you, I sat down immediately and wrote an op-ed that the Kansas Reflector published. Because, one of the things was, she's never performed surgery. What he didn't understand was that the root of that means to teach.
Right.
And The medical profession used it 200 years after professors used it. So, yeah, so it was kind of, you're right, it was sort of fun for the rest of us out there to do it. But what about the term First Lady? Some people have said it's outdated. It's been picked up around the world. Anita, what do you think about the title?
Well, you think about how Jackie Kennedy didn't like to be called First Lady. She thought it was a name, sounded like the name of a horse. And she just did not like it at all. And but as you say, in the late 1880s, it became sort of the way now that we described the spouse of the president. And it was at really the funeral for Dolly Madison that President Zachary Taylor, in his eulogy of her in 1849, referred to her as the First Lady of the land. And so it started to kind of catch on. And then Lucy Webb Hayes in the 1870s was referred to as First Lady. But really by 1890 now, this became the way we referred to. And I think, look, like everything else in our country, things change. At some point, we're going to have a man in this position. And we came close to that in 2008 when Hillary Clinton was running for the nomination, and then in 2016 when she was running for president and had her party's nomination. And that would have been very interesting because here, this would have been a former president. And really even the role, what he would, do, because he had a full-time job running a foundation, too. But I'm a very big believer that the White House adjusts to its occupants and the occupants adjust to the White House. And things, the country moves forward as it needs to. And this was a major way that it did already, with the First Lady having a job outside the White House and having a title of her own.
Yeah, and even when we are, look, it's the first, what's great about the East Wing is that it's a small knit group, it's a small space, and she's in her office every day. Even when she's teaching, she comes back to the office, but it's, hey, Dr. B, how's it going? Or we just walk in and walk out. She's very casual about that, and I think that's what makes her great. There is not a lot of formality to her. She doesn't like that, and when we're doing roundtables or when she's meeting with people and there's like a place card, it just says Jill. It doesn't say Dr. Biden or First Lady. It just says Jill, and she prefers you to just call her Jill. So she tries to take a lot of the formality out of it. And I don't think intentionally. I think just
that's her.
That's who she is, and that's just who she always is.
Anita and I, through Michael, were able to interview her for our book, had a phone interview, and she kept saying, just call me Jill, call me Jill. So it was hard to do, though.
Yes,
but,
I know.
this gets to, Anita mentioned, what happens when we have the first gentleman. And we get asked this all the time. So what have we learned from Doug Emhoff about titles and roles and with the second gentleman now?
Well, I think
he's rolled with it.
I think he's rolled with it. I think that being number 4 is hard because there's no playbook, there's no rule. It's like the First Lady. There's really no rules for it except not trying to get ahead of the other 3. And Doug is so affable and he's so excited to be there, and I think he wants to do so much, and I think he's searching for that right now, and he's doing a great job. He just went over to Germany, sort of leaning in on his Jewish heritage. But that's a tough role to figure out, and I think it helped Dr. Biden having been second lady. It was a huge advantage going in to the transition, and while we were not in contact with our predecessor, she didn't really need there was not much of a learning curve, I would say. She came in and we kind of hit the ground running because she had that experience. She knew the issues, she knew the staff she wanted.
And she knew what she wanted to do.
Yeah, she just sort of hit the ground running. I think those 8 years as a second spouse helped. But it was unique to her too. And I think her and Doug have a great relationship. He travels a lot with us and they have a good chemistry. So she gives him advice.
Great. One of the things that has changed over time is one of the things we talk about is that as women's roles in our society changed, especially women in terms of political roles, the role of First Lady sort of began to respond to that. So the political role that a president plays, the First Ladies were really not allowed to do much of that. Martha wrote some letters where she had some opinions about the fact we just needed to make peace with England and put the war behind us and move on. But those were in private letters. So now that First Ladies take political roles, what can you, Michael, I'll let you start with that since we just had the midterms and we saw a lot of Dr. Biden.
Yeah.
What are the kind of unique opportunities that First Ladies have from a political perspective to help their husbands and party and what all?
Well, it's so funny because I was doing, when she was traveling a lot during the midterms, and there was a large red wave expected to come, so the Democrats weren't expected to do very well. So she was being sent all over the place to help candidates, to fundraise, to travel. And if you go back, I was going back to even 1978 and Rosalind Carter getting out on the campaign trail, and in 1990 a Barbara Bush article about her schedule, and 2006, I think it was 2006, it was like Chicago or Illinois Republicans want Laura, send Laura.
Yeah.
Michelle Obama.
It was exhausting.
Everybody wants the spouse of the president because they can still raise a lot of money, but they're not.
They don't have
I said that I got in trouble with the White House when I said this in the New York Times a couple months ago. What did I say? That First Lady sometimes can shed the sheen of politics in a way that's like not offensive to people. So like they're not really held responsible for the decisions their husbands made, and nor should they be. They're advocates for their husband and champions for their husband. But I think that's why there's a lot of hype around having like the First Lady come campaign for you.
Sure.
It's usually a value add. There's usually no downside to it politically. And this First Lady was a reluctant campaigner. It took her a long time to evolve public speaking. She did not like it. She liked being in her classroom, but being in the classroom, it was not like speaking to strangers in Iowa and New Hampshire in like 1987. And that first campaign was a scarring experience for her, I think. It taught her a lot about politics. She had only been married to him for about 10 years by that point. So she had been through some Senate campaigns, but nothing like the presidential campaign. And it was the first time she had ever seen his integrity attacked. And that was...
This was in 88?
At 88, yeah. It was like 87, but like the 88 campaign. That was so painful for her. And I think she was a 30-something. I think it made an impression on her. And so she's played a role in all of his campaigns in terms of she's always in the room when big decisions are made. She was for him running, like in 2007, she was all supportive of it. 2004, she was against it. 2016, she was not ready. 2019, she wanted him to do it.
Okay. What did you see, Anita, with the political side?
Well, I think it's very true. First Ladies are a lot more welcome, particularly in states or districts or things where the president is not popular. That's just normal. They don't carry the burden and the weight of the decision making that the president has, and so they are great fundraisers. And I think a lot of them, I know Laura Bush, when she married her husband, they dated for just 6 weeks and then they were engaged and then married, within 3 months of meeting, he was running for Congress. So she is a very shy and quiet, person. This was not natural for her. She made him promise she'd never have to give a political speech in their life. So that she went and she did a political speech early, on in this congressional race. And, she found she had some great prepared material and she delivered that. And then she sort of mumbled through the end of it and sat down and said, I'll never be unprepared that way again. And she wasn't. She became an extremely good speaker, very effective. She was extraordinary at the conventions in 2000 and 2004. In 2000, her convention speech, because by this point it became de rigueur that first ladies or the candidates' spouses would give a primetime speech to a convention. But her setting was in 2000 in Philadelphia, was set up like a classroom. And she talked about education and the education reform that they had been engaged in Texas, and that her husband cared about, that this was a civil right and that he cared about education. So that environment made her comfortable. And she just really got better and better at it. She was a great speaker, and as Michael said, in 2006, she was out there a lot. You know, she was really the one that was requested, and the White House has had her out everywhere. And her simple request of them was, I'll go anywhere you need me to go. It just needs to make sense. I have to be, you know, they have to want me to go there. She didn't want to go somewhere where she wouldn't be welcome, but it was hardly ever that she wasn't welcome. And that, you know, so she built up over time, really the comfort to campaign. Barbara Bush was a natural at it. I mean, just a real natural, because it's just her way. She was, you know, she was witty. She can slice and dice pretty good though, too.
She talked to the press a lot, too.
She talked to the press a lot, open. She just, you know, was very comfortable with it. I think, though, you know, one of the things, it's tough to be a campaign spouse. It's tough to be in front of reporters, as you know, Michael. You don't want to be caught, you know, by a trick question. And because you don't want the light of day to be between you and your spouse.
I got stories.
That is right. That is the most difficult thing. They don't want to be the story.
They don't want to be the
They
story.
want to help. They don't want to be the story.
Michael, tell us one.
Supporting
You
actor.
can't get by
Yeah.
with that comment without telling a story.
Oh, I mean, it was just, you know, and I had come from the media, so I had understood a little bit about being on both sides. And I know that there is look, to make it work, you have to give a little, you have to get a little, there's a symbiotic relationship with the press and the people in politics. But like, one thing that I always made clear before we committed to interviews and when we would do them, and by the way, in that campaign, we were begging for press because in a field of 20 candidates in 2020, you know, this spouse had her own team, so it was having two principals that was great, but trying to get press to cover the former second lady. So we would always want to do a lot of press, but we just try to remind them, you know, like, she's not a politician. She's his spouse. She can tell you, she knows him better than anybody. She can talk about him, but she can't, you know, like, she's not a public policy expert. And she would be the first one to tell you. So when she was getting a question about the budget deficit, and
Yeah,
she just
right.
had the, you know, microphone, it was just like,
Yeah, that's tough.
but she, no, there was sometimes reporters, most of them respected that she is his spouse. She's not the candidate. She's not the lawmaker. But there were some who, no matter how much, I wouldn't even call it a negotiation, but it was, you know, especially around the issue of immigration for some reason. And we tried to do so much outreach to non-traditional media outlets, to talk to, you know, Latino voters, but because we knew that Latino voters wanted to talk about more than just immigration, right? The economy, but their media certainly did not. And it made me, they want to always, you know, why should we trust your husband? Why should we trust your husband for X, Y, and Z? And that was hard because, you know, she doesn't have the policy solutions, and she's not expected to.
But she can talk to his character, and
Yeah.
I think
Yeah.
that's the only, that's the biggest difference from any surrogate that can go out and speak about the candidate. Spouse knows them the best and can speak to their character, to them as a family person, and that's a different connection with the public than anybody else.
And those convention speeches, you mentioned, and of course Elizabeth Dole's is one of a kind, where she basically did an Oprah style. I mean, we're hoping to work with Audrey and do a program on Elizabeth and some of the other women who did not become First Lady, but their speeches. But those convention speeches, I mean, one of the major things that they do is present their husband and humanize them in a way that nobody else can. And you're right, they build that trust. You see them as a human being. And that's, I think, important for voters to see.
And it was really interesting that you said she did it in the background of a classroom.
Well, she had like sort of students and desks.
And we actually, because
you were in a classroom.
we were physically in her old classroom in one of the
As a
schools she
teacher.
taught in Wilmington.
Right.
And we turned it into the place where she would give her convention speech. And, other than trying to, we knew why this would be different, obviously, but one of the things we talked about over the summer was, well, how can we really make this speech stand out, aside from just not physically being on a stage? And so one of the things, as a former TV producer, I said, well, movement. So we had her walk and talk for a little bit before she got to the camera. And I held my breath because it's live TV. And when you're walking and talking, luckily she pulled it off. She did a great job, and it was a good speech. And she talked about how, as a family, they were able to put a broken family back together, not once but twice. That he had to do that, and that's really how she tried to humanize him at this particular moment of trying to heal a nation that was in deep need of healing, not just politically but also because of the pandemic.
Well, you mentioned the word diplomacy in one of the early responses, and that was part of what George used Martha for, and what Dolly Madison, Abigail, you had diplomats coming in, especially to a new country, so they were there to be very gracious. And I know when I was researching Martha, somebody wrote a letter back in Europe to Mother saying, George didn't talk to me, but Martha certainly did, and she was gracious. And that letter was then in Martha's collection. So you both had some interesting experiences with your first ladies in diplomacy. So if you could maybe share a little tidbit of their diplomatic skills and some of their diplomatic activities. And this will be our last question before we go to yours.
Well, I think, this role of First Lady is so unique on so many levels. I mean, just the understanding of being part of our national politics and our public policy, but on the global diplomacy piece, you are the president's representative when you're traveling overseas, representing the American people. And what I found is that the leaders, of a foreign country that you're meeting with, I mean, it's a big deal for them that the President of the United States has sent their spouse to meet with them. And we'd have meetings with them, would be hosted by them. And of course, the First Lady working with her counterparts, with other First Ladies around the world. It was extraordinary. I mean, we went to 77 countries, 67 of them in the second 4 years. So we were really busy on the diplomatic front. And a lot of it was to support and promote what was a major global initiative by the administration, the Emergency Plan for AIDS Relief. So we were in Africa for 15 different times. But then she also was doing things that were fit into the goals of the administration, but were really reflective of her interest too, and that was on global education and literacy. And so we traveled all over on that issue. She extended it to a global health diplomacy platform that going all over the Middle East, talking about breast cancer, and going into Saudi Arabia, where the word breast wasn't mentioned in public, much like it was here in the 70s when Betty Ford went public. I mean, that's such an example of First Lady leadership that just sort of pushes pushes the envelope a little bit, pushes the needle, helps people to think differently about a topic. So the diplomacy extended beyond the hostessing. It really did. It just was a very important contribution to the goals and the foreign policy goals of the president and the administration at the time. And you have to remember the 8 years of the Bush administration, it was 2 wars. It was tough and consequential, controversial, and harder for the president to travel many places. He did the things he had to do, the annual events, the summits, and the things he had to be at, and then, but it was easier for her to go on some of these softer power, softer diplomacy issues, and she was incredibly welcomed. It was really very valuable time spent, for sure.
Yeah, and I would say something similar. It was really important. The Japanese government, when they were hosting the Olympics, it was pushed to 2021. They very much wanted the president and first lady to come, and I think they even cornered at one of the summits at the G8. Oh yeah, we were getting out of the car, coming in, and all of a sudden the president, prime minister, and first lady of Japan are like asking her, and there's like no protocol person. It's we're like, oh my God, what do we do? But we did end up going, and it was really important for the Japanese government. They desperately wanted the first lady to come because they want the United States to kind of bless the games and to show support for the games and the athletes. So it was a huge credibility builder for the Japanese government, and she had not done like a serious solo trip like that. I mean, she had, I guess, as VP, and when he was VP, but getting off the plane and going to dinner just with the prime minister and his wife, and translate, talking.
Absolutely.
And, that was all. It was all new and fresh for her, and then going to meet the emperor the next day, and then sitting in the box representing the United States for like 3 hours during the opening ceremony. I don't know how she did it, but it was a lot of diplomacy. It was diplomacy at work, actually.
And it was for the American people to see that too, to see that our
And for
leaders,
the athletes.
the athletes,
Because their
loved it.
parents couldn't come.
Right, exactly. And I remember this, actually, the Olympics in Beijing, when we want big same thing. The Chinese leaders really wanted President Bush to come. It's important when the United States of America is present at a world event. It's really important. And so we went to your point, to the athletes, Michael. Swimming was a big deal in 2008, right? We all remember Michael Phelps and his successes. But there was one of the swimmers, his name was Larson Jensen. He won the silver medal for the breaststroke. And we were sitting all up in the stands, President and Mrs. Bush and our U.S. delegation. And so he won the silver medal. And he turned around, saw Mrs. Bush sitting there, and took the flowers that were given to him and ran them up to her. And he said, "My mother can't be here, and you are representing our country." I know. It just was so emotional. He turned out really, he came to visit at the White House. You know how all the athletes come, the Olympians come, and he asked our office, so our First Lady's office, we kind of adopted him. We loved that he did that to Mrs. Bush, right? And he asked, he said, I would like to have a meeting with the president. I'm like, oh, okay. But what he did, he wanted the president's support to become a Navy SEAL.
Oh my God.
And it was just incredible. And I went to his graduation, my son and I went to his graduation, top of his class. You just can't imagine the people that you meet and the privileges that we've had. It was a privilege for our First Ladies to have this role, but it was such a privilege for us too, the people we met, right, all around the country and all around the world. And just really, really memorable.
Any last thoughts on diplomacy, Michael, before we turn it over?
No,
to you?
I will just say one of the biggest things that we did during my time there that I'll never forget was when we crossed into Ukraine and went deeper into the country than anybody had really been, especially with the press. And it was not necessarily, I think, it wasn't our war. So there was no green zone, there was no safe zone. This was not our war. So the Secret Service and regional security, State Department, it was, I wouldn't say they were not supportive. They were going to do whatever the First Lady wanted to do. But it was, people were uneasy, yeah, and we had to stop at the border, and we had to kind of keep some people back and sort of drop our footprint a bit, and it was like a convoy rolling into this like really gray, rainy, sad country, and but when we did it, and we were able to kind of pull this off, to help bring the First Lady of Ukraine out of hiding, because by that point she had been in hiding since February, and it was a powerful moment normally I'm riding with the press. That particular day, when we had to drop our footprint, somehow I ended up in the car with Dr. Biden. So we drove in, and I'm getting out of the car, and I'm like trying to find the press because they're behind. I'm like, get over here. And then it was just this moment where the two First Ladies got out of these Suburbans and just walked towards each other and just embraced. And I had one camera to catch it for the entire media that we had to hold on to for a little bit. We couldn't get it out right away, obviously, but it kind of gives me chills just thinking about that embrace and we brought her flowers, and it was such a. It was Mother's Day, and like that was why Dr. B wanted to go. The intent was to go spend Mother's Day with the mothers and families who were basically refugees in Romania and Slovakia, and we did. And then we went to the border crossing, to kind of a processing center for refugees coming into Slovakia, and then what was not public was that we were going into a kind of a school that was turned into a shelter for these people, where teachers were teaching kids still, Ukrainian children and their parents, and so the First Ladies embraced and went inside and talked privately for a little bit, and then we allowed our press to talk to them for a little bit, and we spent about an hour and a half, 90 minutes, maybe 2 hours, and as soon as we crossed the border, then the press was allowed to file and hit go. So it was a little bit of a frenzy, but it was some interesting. It was history being made, and it was in the middle of the beginning of this war, and it was just so sad. Everything was, we talked about this the other night, just some of these experiences, real life, real world outside of the United States. It was hard for me.
Yeah. But again, it mattered that the United States was there, and that was the message. It was the message to Ukrainians. It was a message to Americans.
Yeah.
And she was the reflection of that.
Yeah.
And that was really important.
And there are a lot of examples in our history of that.
Right.
You're going to hear about Pat Nixon in a few weeks. And
Yes,
places
exactly.
she went, and
Yeah,
just
the credit that she deserves.
Eleanor,
and what we know that Edith Roosevelt did in the
Panama.
Russo-Japanese War.
Yeah.
She was the go-between, and nobody knew that. And he gets the Nobel Peace Prize.
Yeah,
But
yeah.
she was part of the negotiating behind the scenes.
Yeah. Edith did
it's
the work, and
great.
Teddy got the prize.
Yeah.
Okay. A reminder that those of you watching us at home, you can submit your questions to Dole Questions, all lowercase, one word, at ku.edu. But we have two microphones, so raise your hand and we'll find you. And remember, questions, and keep it relatively brief. I only got through about half of what I wanted to talk
I
about.
know,
So
we know,
yeah,
we're
we'll see
self-prepared.
what you want to talk about. Anybody going to be brave to ask the first one?
We'll go.
Hi, first I would just want to say thank you so much for giving us the opportunity to learn from you all tonight, from your expertise and scholarship. My question for you is, how have different First Ladies handled sexist narratives from the media, specifically from news and entertainment media?
Well, we talked a little bit about this with the title, and that at the time was seen as one of the most sexist things that we experienced had gone through. Was that Wall Street Journal op-ed about her title. And then I would say that versus the campaign, when we got to the transition, and then I started getting more questions about what she was wearing and what designers and those kinds of things versus like what her platform, what we were going to pursue as an office and the meaningful, significant work or some of her passion projects. So I always tried to get into the habit of not answering those questions. We weren't going to talk about her clothes unless you're going to ask the president where his suit is from. That was just kind of a rule. Now on big occasions, when she wore the sunflower to the, she had sunflowers knitted on a dress last minute for the State of the Union last year for Ukraine. I think we got into it. We talked about it up front on that. And on Inauguration Day, we did give the reporters a heads up, because even the male reporters wanted to know like who the designers were. Because she was wearing a dress during the day with a mask, and then at night her gown, which she didn't have a inaugural ball gown, but they went out to the Lincoln Memorial together and fireworks in the balcony, and that was a dress that had I think
Flowers of all the states.
the flowers or the birds,
With flowers.
flowers of all the states
Yeah.
knitted on
All
them for
50 states.
unity. She tends to do stuff like that a lot and tends to use young designers. But those were questions I always found kind of, annoying.
You know what? But they're just part of the drill. And actually,
it's just part of the drill.
Yeah, that's right. And this is the funniest quote, right, from the press secretary to Betty Ford has the best quote about this. She said, "I could tell the reporters that Betty Ford ran out of the White House, ran out of a burning building, and the reporters would ask me, but what was she wearing?" I mean, that it is just something they have all had to. Now, I will say that to the clothes that Michael just described that Dr. Biden wore, so they were just donated to the Smithsonian. That is the most visited gallery in the American History Museum, is the First Ladies Gallery. There is something about seeing the clothes that First Ladies have worn that gives you this incredible connection to who they are, but it says a lot about the times, says a lot about the culture, women's place in society. It's not necessarily a bad thing. Her clothes were very special, and these flowers from all the states that were sewn into them, but the flower of Delaware over her heart. Very very meaningful things, and will be the only clothes in the Smithsonian that have corresponding masks, face masks. And that will tell the story 100 years from now. People ask, why are there? Well, because there was a pandemic. So there's something about about the clothing. And someday, listen, there will be a glass case for a man's suit at the inaugural exhibit.
And what color tie did he choose?
And what color tie?
I told her, I said, I learned more about your clothes from these reporters than I ever expected to learn about
there
female
is just
fashion.
something. But it also does support a fashion industry. That's an American industry. When that light is shined, those two young designers that were at the Smithsonian reveal, and they spoke what this meant for them and their small business, was really, really meaningful. So,
Well, and it goes back to Martha. Martha only wore American-made clothes to prove that we were an independent country.
Right.
We did not need Europe. And there was a ladies' magazine that started during the Washington administration, and there's a letter in Martha's collection of letters from the magazine sending her the first issue. and asking if she would become, and they use this word, an influencer
An influencer.
for their
Right.
magazine.
And so nothing's changed.
Nothing's
right?
changed.
There was no
Influencer. They wanted
TikTok
Martha to be
then.
an influencer. And Dolly, it's been that way forever. Yeah. So another question, very good one.
Thank you. You have both had such absolutely amazing careers, both in politics and out of politics. What advice do you have for students who are looking to follow in your footsteps in either the political aspect or just in your life?
Well, I'll just say something very quickly, and then I'll leave it to Michael, because he did have a different career path, being in the media first. And I never intended to go into politics. I was a pre-med student. That's what I wanted to do. I wanted to go into gerontology. I grew up with my grandparents. I always wanted to take care of the elderly. I just didn't do well in school, and that I had to make a pivot to something else. But I think one of the things that really interested me was volunteering on a campaign. And I've been on losing campaigns and winning campaigns. It's a great experience to have that opportunity to, sort of work for a candidate. I liked the one-on-one side of politics, getting on the phone, calling people, going knocking on doors. It's different now. It's not that way. It's more televised. But volunteering on a campaign, I think even if it's a local, office, I think it's really important. I think that we all should know more about our government. I worry about that. I think there's just such a lack of civic education, knowing the process from beginning to end in our country, understanding our history, understanding the importance of that. And so I would say take advantage of an opportunity if one presents itself. I think it would be, you'll find it. And you don't have to go into politics yourself, but understanding how important that is to our system, I think, is important to do.
So two things. I think one, I would just say that there are going to be times during your career that you're going to be frustrated. I always say my horrible year was like 2009. I think I had like 3 or 4 jobs.
Yeah.
And I did them for all the right reasons. They just didn't work out, and it was just a bad year, and you're going to have some bad years.
Absolutely.
And to just not be discouraged, because your career path isn't going to be linear. And I used to think it was going to be in college. Like I was going to follow the path of these political. I grew up when Bill Clinton was like my hero when I was young, because I grew up watching him on TV, and he was this young guy. So the people that worked for him were the people I wanted to emulate. But my career did not take me those places. It took me, it was just not linear. So don't be discouraged, and
Be open to change.
the other thing I would say is to try to meet as many people as possible. I told the story, I think I've been doing this now for 17 years. I was in college. My college internship, the people that I met at my college internship, we didn't talk consistently over the last 17 years or so, but several of them became, mentors of mine, and introduced me to people who did give me opportunities and give me chances. And if it weren't for that internship, I would never have been invited into the Biden orbit, because I was never a Biden person. And they don't, and Anita can probably tell you that it's hard to break into, especially a political, not family, but a politician who's been around for years and has layers and layers of people around him, and a protective nucleus who rarely let outsiders in. But it was because I had this internship and met some really great women who ironically worked for First Lady Hillary Clinton. I would end up going to work for the spouse of a candidate running for president who ended up winning. And there's a lot of irony in it, but the biggest takeaway is to, establish relationships. I know it sounds cheesy, but network.
Network, for sure.
It's like, I know you've probably heard all, like, it's not about the grades you make, it's about the hands you shake. I should say that on a college campus, but it's true. It can define your career and just meet people and be open-minded about people and your relationships with people. And especially in a town like Washington, I know it doesn't seem it from the outside, but Republicans and Democrats actually really do get along.
We're here. We're an example of that.
And I have so many relationships on the other political side that I value and who are just incredible people. We just have different politics. But if you are comfortable in your politics, you really don't let politics affect your relationships.
Another question? Over here?
Hi.
Hi.
A question about what happens when there is a first male spouse is often raised. But what happens when there is a president without a spouse? Obviously, there were before, but not in modern times. So how would this administration function in modern times if it happens, based on your experience?
Well, I think just based on the experience of history, when there have been presidents who haven't had a spouse and other people in their life would step in for a ceremonial role in particular, whether it was a sister or a niece, and we've certainly had those examples. And again, I think I go back to what I mentioned earlier. I just think the White House adapts, to the occupants in the White House, and the occupants do the same thing. I think that it's a very resilient place, and I think we just would figure out how to make that work, and what role would a surrogate come in and take on to help the president.
I also think that probably the East Wing now,
would operate
the way it
more
operates,
differently.
it's very operational, that you'd probably see a very empowered social office, maybe
Right.
a larger one,
Right.
or
A chief of protocol might
something
take
like
on
that,
a
where
little more.
an East Wing could run, and you won't necessarily have a first spouse, but you would have the function of that office being carried out by the incredible people who work there.
I think it's one thing that we didn't talk about tonight that's really important to the life of the White House, and this has fallen on first ladies mostly, but it is the preservation of the White House and the caretaking of it. This is the most important symbol in our country. Everyone knows it around the world and what it means. And the caretaking of it, we think of Jackie Kennedy and all that she did to put a structure around the protection and preservation of the White House. But other first ladies through history certainly have. Bess Truman, I mean, we really have her to thank for protecting the exterior of the White House when the Congress wanted to take the whole thing down, when it was falling apart from the inside out. And and she was very astute and said, the American people will never forgive you if you do that. And so this part of the role has fallen, or the responsibilities of the presidency has fallen really on the First Lady. So it would be interesting to see, if there's not a spouse, who would help manage that. I guess the curator just does its job, and the White House Historical Association, which is the private arm that funds all of the restorations and acquisitions and things that keep the White House a museum quality. Again, another brainchild of Jackie Kennedy. It's brilliant as a 31-year-old woman to put this structure in place that she knew would preserve the White House forever, no matter who the president and first lady was. So that would be interesting to see how that would happen. Who would
One
take
more.
care of
Yeah, we
that.
have one more question. Time for one more.
This is fun, though.
Okay. Sure. Were there any online? No. Okay.
So that kind of brings up a question for me is there some kind of institutional knowledge at the White House? in the First Lady's wing? Does the staff provide that institutional knowledge?
Great
You know, like the fact that you just said that they had to protect the White House, the building itself. How would you know that that was your job? Is there a manual? You know, and you can decide whether you want to follow the manual or
That's
not.
right.
Right.
But
That's right.
I think it would be very helpful to have a manual.
So there isn't a manual, and we often reminded ourselves of that. There was no rule book, and you can be as creative in the job as you want, and be as aggressive or as intentional as you want. So we were kind of, we used history as a guide and what other First Ladies have done. If there was a question we had, like, can a First Lady do X, Y, or Z? Well, let's go see if it's been done before.
Right.
And sure enough, sometimes we would look and First Ladies had. So, I mean, I hope that that Dr. B maybe changed the rule book a little bit by maybe showing a younger generation of women that you don't have to give up your day job. But that also comes with, you know, responsibility. Like, we had to dot some I's and cross some T's to make sure that that was done in a very ethical, and
Sure.
she takes a salary, and
Sure.
she, you know, all that stuff was worked out, and it was, and it's all great. But I hope in some ways we changed the rule book in that way.
Well, it did push it forward, and again, this is a position with absolutely no position description. Each person rewrites it, and but there is some, you know, there are things in this country we have called transitions, and you all didn't have a normal transition. And we didn't have a normal transition in 2000
That's right.
either. For 6 weeks, no one knew who the president was going to be. And so the rules were not really in place or not up to date with the Presidential Transition Act to allow a would-be, you know, candidate or would-be president to even have any conversation, you know, with the sitting White House. That all has changed. 9/11 has changed all that, for sure. But one of the things that I feel most proud about when we left in 2008, and this actually started a year before we left, President Bush had told his chief of staff that he did not want any president in the future to have the kind of transition that he did. And he wanted that too much was at stake now after 9/11, for sure. So we were all instructed, every office, including the First Lady's office, we all had to do a manual, a handoff manual of every single thing that we were responsible for. So this would go from the social you know, aspect of the White House all the way up to the national security aspect and the tabletop exercises that they went through in the event of a national security event. But for the First Lady's office, we did that. And we left that manual. We also brought in the incoming staff of Mrs. Obama. That was the other thing President Bush had wanted us to do, to invite the staff who had been named for our successors into
so
the office.
gracious.
And we did. We had several days.
Get
And
anything like
you have
that.
to imagine, it was emotionally hard for our staff who were leaving. They didn't know where they were going on. Many of them didn't have jobs. But we did. We had that exercise. And it was very helpful. And so that manual is left, you know, behind. And I know from my successor that she referred to it a lot. Now, that's for the staff. That's not really, you know, for the First Lady personally, but all that structure around the First Lady helps in them to execute, you know, their job. And that's why I felt, you know, for their administration, for the Biden administration coming in, they didn't have the benefit of that. And it really You know, it helps.
got out of that parade, I walked in and had to I didn't even know where the East Wing was.
Yes.
I had to ask directions. I sat at a desk that just became my desk
Yeah,
for the
yeah.
entire year and a half.
No,
That was
that's
it. It had
true.
boxes with Catholics
Right.
for Trump all over it. And signs everywhere, and
Mm-hmm.
Melania's gift closet. That was my office.
That stuff hadn't been
We
cleaned
just
out.
kind of squatted and figured it out. Literally, that was it.
And that's the point. We figure it out.
Yeah.
We figure it out. That's for sure.
Well, these were great questions. You've been a wonderful audience. And let's thank Anita and Michael again.
Thank you.
I hope this has given you a taste for 3 more nights over the next, this February and March. So you've kicked this off just like I hoped you would, so thank you. And Audrey and Sarah, Stacy, I cannot thank you enough for everything you have done, for the logistics on this, and the whole Dole staff for making this so easy. So thank you again. And I don't know, Audrey, any last words from you? We are going to have book signing if anybody's interested. There are some books from the University Press of Kansas. You should be aware that there has been a long-term series that University Press of Kansas has done on First Ladies. They don't have all of them, but there are several, and several of the authors will be here over the next few weeks. In fact, the author of the Florence Harding book will be here next week. So we're really,
good for
you know,
Kansas.
this is the only press that has concentrated on First Ladies. And I think we should be really proud of
And
that.
I
So,
will say, American University, where I am, is the only university that has an initiative that's actually focused on the study of First Ladies.
Yeah.
And now with Flair, I mean, we're trying to really
yeah.
broaden the network
Right, yeah.
of this study.
So,
and the
like I said,
interest.
we're thrilled that the Dole Institute has joined the White House Historical Association, the Massachusetts Historical Association, the National Trust for Historic Preservation, Rider University, of course,
Ford
American
Library.
University, the Ford Library Foundation, the George W. Bush Presidential Studies Center at SMU. And, I mean, we've got some real leaders
jumping on the
out here, so,
bandwagon.
and National First Ladies Library. So a lot's going to happen through Flair and through the collaborations that we're creating so that we can have more of this kind of programming for people around the country. So thank you again, and
Thank
thanks to the
you.
Dole Institute.
Thank you.
And safe travels, Anita and Michael.
Thank you.
Thank you.